My name is Thea Rivers, and I'm 31 years old. The morning of my wedding, I stood in front of the mirror at the Hartwell Manor bridal suite and thought I had already survived the hardest part of my family's approval. I was wrong. My mother, Eleanor, had spent 6 months telling me the dress I chose was too revealing for a woman marrying into a respectable family. It was a simple lace gown, cap sleeves, nothing scandalous, but nothing pleased my mother unless it was her idea first. I brushed off her comments the way I always had because that day wasn't about her. It was about me and Grant Ashworth, the man who had waited 2 deployments and 11 months of long-distance calls just to stand across from me at an altar. The ceremony started at 4 o'clock in the afternoon under a canopy of white orchids in the manor's garden. My father walked me down the aisle, his hand trembling slightly, though I never knew if it was pride or nerves. Grant stood at the end in his dress blues because even on our wedding day, the Marine Corps was part of who he was. I remember locking eyes with him and forgetting for one full breath that my mother was seated 3 rows back with her arms crossed and her jaw set in that familiar line of disapproval. The vows went smoothly. The rings were exchanged. The officiant pronounced us husband and wife, and the crowd rose in applause. That should have been the happiest moment of my life, and for about 4 seconds, it was. Then my mother stood up from her seat, walked straight down the aisle in front of 200 guests, grabbed my arm, and said the words I will never forget. "No daughter of mine wears that." Before I could respond, before Grant could even step forward, her hand came across my face, so hard my vision blurred white. The crowd froze. My jaw felt shattered and blood stained the white lace of my gown where I'd bitten the inside of my cheek from the force of the blow. I stumbled back against the arbor, one hand pressed to my face, my ears ringing so loud I couldn't hear the gasps around me. Someone screamed. My father didn't move. My new husband did. Then my husband, a Marine pilot, calmly said, "You just assaulted an officer. Face the wall." His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Grant had spent 9 years learning how to command a room without raising his tone, and in that moment, every guest, every waiter, every member of the string quartet went completely silent. My mother turned to him stunned, her hands still raised as if she couldn't believe what she just done. "Excuse me," she said, but Grant didn't repeat himself. He simply stepped between us, positioned his body like a wall, and nodded toward one of his groomsmen, a fellow officer named Desmond Cole, who was already reaching for his phone. I remember tasting copper in my mouth as I watched my mother's face shift from fury to confusion to something close to fear. She had spent my entire life controlling every detail of who I was allowed to be, what I wore, who I dated, how I spoke at dinner parties, and she had never once faced a consequence for any of it. My father had always smoothed things over. My aunts had always changed the subject. But Grant Ashworth did not grow up in my family, and he did not operate by my family's rules. "She's my wife now," Grant said, still calm, still controlled. "And you just struck her in front of 200 witnesses, several of whom are active duty officers required by regulation to report incidents of assault." My mother opened her mouth to argue, but nothing came out. For the first time in 31 years, I watched my mother realize that her word was not going to be the final one in the room. The wedding planner rushed forward with ice wrapped in a linen napkin. My bridesmaid, a woman named Corinne Delgado, who had been my roommate since college, guided me to a chair while my makeup artist dabbed at the blood on my lip with trembling hands. My mother tried to approach me again, saying something about how I had embarrassed the family by wearing a dress that showed my collarbones, but Grant's friend Desmond stepped between us before she could get close. Within 20 minutes, 2 officers from the local precinct arrived, alerted by a guest who worked in law enforcement and had already called it in before Grant even asked. My mother's face went pale as they asked her to step aside for questioning. I sat there in my ruined wedding dress, ice against my swelling jaw, watching the woman who raised me get read her rights in front of everyone who had come to celebrate the happiest day of my life. I didn't cry. I was too stunned to cry. I just watched her, and for the first time I didn't feel like her daughter. I felt like a witness to something that had been building for 3 decades finally breaking open in front of a garden full of white orchids and horrified guests. The officers didn't arrest my mother that evening, not officially. They took statements, photographed the bruise already forming along my jaw, and told her she'd be hearing from the district attorney's office within the week. Grant refused to let the incident get buried under polite excuses. He gave his statement calmly, the same way he'd spoken to my mother in the garden, and Desmond cold-backed every word of it, along with 4 other guests who'd seen the strike happen with their own eyes. My father sat in a folding chair near the gift table, staring at his shoes, saying nothing to defend his wife and nothing to comfort me, either. That silence told me more about him than any conversation we'd had in 31 years. We didn't get our first dance that night. We didn't cut the cake. Grant carried me out to the car in my torn, blood-stained gown while our guests watched in stunned silence, and he drove me straight to urgent care instead of our honeymoon suite. The doctor said my jaw wasn't broken, just deeply bruised, but the inside of my cheek needed 2 stitches where my teeth had cut through when she struck me. I sat on that exam table in my wedding dress, veil still pinned in my hair, and finally let myself cry. Not because of the pain, but because some small part of me had hoped my mother would surprise me one day. She never did. The following week, the district attorney's office contacted me directly. Because the assault had occurred in front of over 200 witnesses, including 6 active duty and retired military officers with a legal obligation to report violent incidents they witnessed, the case moved faster than anyone expected. A detective named Priscilla Nunez called to walk me through the process. She explained that with this many corroborating witnesses and a video recording from the wedding photographer that had captured the entire incident from a side angle, my mother had almost no room to argue self-defense or accident. I hadn't even known the photographer, a quiet woman named Wilhelmina Frost, had caught the moment on film until Detective Nunez mentioned it. That footage became the centerpiece of the case. My mother hired an expensive attorney and initially pleaded not guilty, telling anyone who would listen that I had provoked her, that the dress was an insult to the family, that I had always been difficult. For a few weeks, I braced myself for a long, ugly trial, the kind that drags a family's private wounds into public record for strangers to read. Grant stood beside me through every meeting with the prosecutor. Every phone call, every sleepless night, I spent replaying the sound of her hand against my face. He never once told me to let it go, and he never once told me to forgive her before. I was ready. He just stayed. 3 weeks after the wedding, everything changed. My mother's attorney requested a private meeting with the district attorney's office. I wasn't in a room, but Detective Nunez told me later what happened. Faced with the video footage, 6 witness statements from officers who couldn't legally look away from what they'd seen, and medical documentation of my injuries, my mother's own attorney advised her that going to trial would almost certainly end in a harsher sentence than accepting responsibility. 2 days later, we were in a courtroom in downtown Fairview, and I watched my mother stand before a judge and confess. She admitted on the record that she had struck me without provocation, that she had planned to make a scene if I wore the dress she disapproved of, and that she had lost control of her temper in front of my entire wedding party. Hearing her say it out loud in a courtroom stripped of every excuse she'd used my whole life was the strangest kind of relief I've ever felt. For 31 years, I had absorbed her criticism, her control, her need to reshape me into someone she approved of. In that courtroom, under fluorescent lights, she finally admitted what I had always known but was never allowed to say, that her love came with conditions, and I had simply reached the point where I stopped agreeing to them. The judge sentenced her to probation, a mandatory anger management program, and a restraining order preventing her from contacting me. For 1 year, my father sat 2 rows behind her, still silent, still unwilling to meet my eyes. I didn't feel triumphant when the gavel came down. I felt exhausted and I felt free, 2 things I never expected to feel at the same time. Grant took my hand as we walked out of that courthouse, and for the first time since